"What exactly do you think you're doing on my floor?" "Not a question," he said it loud. Loud enough for the overhead cranes. Loud enough for 40 sets of hands to slow on their work and then stop. Wrenches half turned, inspection cards half signed, a rolling tool cart left to coast 3 feet and settle against a drain grate on its own. Loud enough to travel the full width of MAGNUM HANGAR in the 0700 light, past 4 CH-53K King Stallions in various states of phase maintenance teardown, past the torque wrench racks and the parts cribs and the fluorescent buzz that had been running at the same pitch under the same man for 9 years. Master Gunnery Sergeant Bryce Halloran took one deliberate step and hit her open-handed across the left cheek, the flat crack of it absorbed almost immediately by the overhead hum, and then stepped back and laughed. She was crouched beside the undercarriage of Iron Fist 2, cross-referencing a Boeing airworthiness certificate against a lot number manifest on a clipboard. She had been on this floor for 10 months in that posture, in that vest, high-visibility yellow over a plain Navy contractor polo, charcoal cargo trousers, steel-toed boots, the kind of equipment that renders a person into a function rather than a presence. Clipboard. Lot numbers. Airworthiness certificates. No name tape. No rank. A contractor lanyard tucked beneath the vest, where no one could read what it said without getting close, and no one had gotten close. Her head came back to center in under 1 second. Feet already shoulder width, exactly where they had been. Hips already squared to the fuselage, exactly as before. The clipboard and the pen settled from her hands to flat against her thighs, not dropped, not gripped, simply placed with the economy of someone who has put things down in worse situations and would need them again in a moment. Her eyes tracked once, briefly, to Halloran's hands rather than his face, not his expression. His hands. Then she turned back to the airworthiness certificate, found her place in the lot number column, and continued. She did not speak. She did not pause. She did not do anything at all except keep working. The nearest lance corporal let a torque wrench hang in his grip and stared at the painted floor between his boots. Nobody said anything. 3 rows back, a corporal held perfectly still in the particular way people go still when they don't trust what their face might do if it moved. Halloran turned to Staff Sergeant Pryor and made a remark about paperwork girls who didn't know when they weren't needed. 2 junior Marines produced sounds that resembled laughter, the kind produced by men who cannot afford not to. The bay resumed its noise reluctantly, unevenly, the way a machine resumes after a belt slips, and no one is certain the tension is right. Halloran walked toward the hangar office. He did not look back. Halloran was 51 years old and had been running this floor since before she was commissioned. He had outlasted 3 commanding officers, 4 maintenance officers of the month, 2 DCMA supervisory reviews, and a wing-level safety audit that had produced exactly 0 findings. He moved through MAGNUM HANGAR like a man who has never once been made to feel temporary, because he had never once been made to feel temporary. The floor was his. The 9-year chain of certified paperwork with his signature on it was his. He did not look back because there was nothing behind him he considered worth looking at. Stallworth's pen was moving again. At the far wall, in the shadow of the parts crib, Sergeant Major Cyrus Valdez set down his radio and did not pick it up again for a long time. 32 years of service. He had watched civilians lose composure at a raised voice, freeze at a sudden loud noise, come apart entirely at a single public humiliation. He had watched experienced Marines do the same things under worse pressure. What he watched now? The specific quality of the stillness in the 1 second after impact. The return of eyes to a lot number column rather than to the man who had just struck her. The complete absence of any vocal or postural response, registered somewhere below language, in the part of a veteran's mind that files things for which there are not yet words. He had seen this before. He could not place it immediately. A desert somewhere, a joint exercise, a different context entirely. He stood at the parts crib and did not reach for his radio, and did not speak, and did not look away from the back of her high-visibility vest for a long time. She did not look up. She did not look down. She turned back to the lot number and found her place as though the last 3 seconds had been data she had already processed and filed, as though they were simply information, accurate and noted, and no longer requiring attention, like a serial number, like a torque value, like any other fact in the long catalog of facts she was holding in her head. Across the bay, without taking his eyes off her back, Valdez opened his logbook to a fresh page and wrote a single line. He closed it. Whatever the line said stayed inside the cover. 2 days later, the morning maintenance brief was Halloran's theater. It had been his theater for 9 years. Same call-outs, same sequence, same architecture of deference built into the same room. No one interrupted him mid-brief. That was the arrangement, and the arrangement had worked because no one on the floor had given him a reason to enforce it. Stallworth was at her folding table, clipboard flat, pen in hand, contractor lanyard tucked beneath the vest. She had been at that table enough mornings that the junior Marines had stopped noticing her, the way you stop noticing a particular fitting on a bulkhead you've walked past 1,000 times. 12 NCOs in the briefing corner. Gunnery Sergeant Bryce at the edge, mid-30s, the kind of NCO who watches rooms rather than briefers when something hasn't added up and he hasn't identified what. Sergeant Major Valdez at the far end of the row, logbook closed in both hands, positioned where he could observe the full floor without appearing to observe anything in particular. Halloran ran phase maintenance status on Iron Fist 2's sequencer cartridge assembly, citing a maintenance record by number from memory, not because he needed to check it, but because the performance of not needing to was the point. He paused at the cartridge lot entry and named the specification. Stallworth raised one hand. She did not stand. Boeing GC46-1017 calls for torque to 75 inch-pounds plus 10. The lot number on the cartridge installed yesterday, Lot 8814 Delta, was certified to the 62 inch-pound standard under MIL DTL 5541 Class 1A. Those are not the same document. A single clean pause. That cartridge needs to come back out. Silence. Complete, unassisted silence. A staff sergeant looked at his shoes. 3 NCOs in the back row quietly pulled out their own specification sheets, the specific motion of men who suspected they already knew the answer and were confirming it anyway. She had not looked at her clipboard. She had not checked a note. She cited the document numbers the way someone recites a date of birth, without effort, without the performance of knowledge, because the information simply lived in her. There was no explanation for how a DCMA civilian carried that precision without notes, unless the notes were not the source of the precision. Halloran looked at her for 3 seconds. Then came the careful, genial smile, the expression of a man who understands he has just been challenged on his own floor in front of 12 NCOs and needs to close the wound before it spreads. He made a remark about civilians who read specifications without the context to understand them fully, and moved on to the next call-out. The room breathed, but 2 NCOs in the back row exchanged a look that had nothing genial in it, and Bryce, at the edge, changed nothing in his expression and filed everything. Bryce stood at the tool rack for another 2 minutes after the brief dispersed, turning a calibration wrench over in his hands without looking at it. He had been at this station for 3 years and in the Corps for 14, and he had a quality of patience that manifested as stillness, the ability to hold an unanswered question without needing to resolve it before the information was complete. He had seen plenty of DCMA inspectors on plenty of floors over 3 years. They argued about procedures, occasionally in the hedged way of civilians who understand they are guests in a room that can make things difficult for them. What he had just watched was not that. The lot number and the document number and the torque specification had come out of her like information already in residence, not information retrieved. He set the wrench back in its slot and went to his work. He did not stop thinking about it. After the brief cleared, Stallworth crossed to the official maintenance board without pausing. The micro camera in her contractor badge lanyard photographed the lot number page in 2 passes before Halloran's crew could cycle it. She was already walking back to her folding table when the nearest Marine looked up from his paperwork. Valdez stepped outside to the apron. Personal cell, not his duty phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in nearly 2 years, held the phone to his ear, and began to speak in a voice too quiet to carry. The call lasted 90 seconds. He ended it and stood looking at the hangar entrance for a long moment, hands at his sides, the morning light flat on the tarmac behind him. Then he went back inside. That evening the floor was empty, and the hangar ran only its standard overnight lighting, amber strips along the deck, the King Stallions in their tear-down positions, like machinery in a dream of machinery. Halloran found her at her workstation alone. He didn't touch her. He leaned close enough that no surface in the room could carry the words. "You should put in for a transfer to a quieter station. This floor isn't built for civilians who ask questions they don't have the tenure to ask." She did not look up from her paperwork. She let the silence sit with him in the room for 5 full seconds. He waited. Then he walked away. The moment his back turned, she circled a lot number on her manifest that had not been circled before. It was not 8814 Delta. On day 5, Halloran moved to infrastructure. The group chat bloomed overnight across the squadron's unofficial network, 43 devices by morning call, the kind of fast lateral spread that only happens when someone with institutional authority has ceded the ground and given the junior members of a unit implicit permission to run with it. Jokes about the DCMA girl. What a contractor like that was actually looking for at a Marine air station. The specific, practiced cruelty of men who understand they are not speaking on record and believe they never will be. Stallworth read it at 0600 on the duty issue tablet, start to finish, without her posture changing or her expression shifting in any direction. She noted the timestamp of the earliest entry, 23:17 hours the previous evening, 9 minutes after Halloran had been observed on his personal phone in the hangar office, and she noted the handle on the seed post, which was not Halloran's name, but was recognizable to anyone who had spent 10 months watching which accounts produced operational information on which schedules. Then she set the tablet face down, opened her paper notebook, and wrote a 5-digit lot code that had nothing to do with anything she had just read. The notebook was for what mattered. At mid-morning, Halloran sent Lance Corporal Demi Okafor across the bay floor with a rag. Okafor was 19 years old, 4 months at the station, still learning which tools lived in which rack and which NCOs you could ask questions in which direction. She was precisely young enough and precisely new enough to be useful as an instrument. She arrived at the contractor's workstation carrying the rag and the expression of someone who has been handed a job they know is wrong and cannot find a way not to do it. Behind her, at the parts crib, a cluster of NCOs arranged themselves with the relaxed posture of men waiting for a punchline to land exactly where it was aimed. Halloran's hands were clean. Halloran's name wasn't attached to any of this in a way that could be written down. Stallworth looked at Okafor for exactly 1 second. She read the room completely in that second. The rag, the gallery, the angle of the watching, the 19-year-old standing at the end of a performance she had not agreed to be in. Then she took 2 steps left. Her feet landed shoulder-width on the bay floor. Her weight settled, not tense, not theatrical, just present in the way a load-bearing structure is present. She placed herself between Okafor and the gallery at the parts crib, and the angle of 30 pairs of eyes hit her instead of the Lance Corporal. There was no punchline. There was no target for it. Okafor worked the workstation in a quiet she hadn't expected, and somewhere in the middle of the task, her hands stopped shaking, though she probably didn't notice the moment they did. Gunnery Sergeant Bryce, at the tool rack, watched. No ring on either hand. No necklace. No earrings. Not even the small civilian studs that most women wore on a maintenance floor without thinking about it. Watch face turned inward against the wrist, pressed flat to the skin, unreadable from any normal angle. The contractor lanyard tucked beneath the vest so completely that you would have to know to look for the outline before you could find it. Bryce said quietly to the corporal beside him, without looking away from the contractor. You ever see a civilian tuck their lanyard under their vest? Watch face down. No jewelry at all? The corporal shrugged. Bryce picked up another wrench, ran the calibration, and put it back in the rack. He did not shrug. Through the hangar office glass, Halloran stood with his personal cell phone at an angle that kept his shoulder between the phone and the floor, the posture of a man who is not calling anyone who should hear hangar noise in the background. He spoke for several minutes. The squadron's group chat timestamp from the previous evening was in Stallworth's notebook already. This call would generate its own entry. The floor had a different quality for the rest of the afternoon. Not louder or quieter, just different in a way that was hard to name. The particular atmospheric shift that happens in a unit when something has happened that everyone saw and no one has named yet, and the process of deciding what it means is running quietly in every person on the floor simultaneously. Bryce went about his calibrations. The junior Marines went about their work. The NCOs from the parts crib gallery drifted back to their stations and did not congregate again that afternoon. Okafor finished the workstation and put the rag away and went to her assigned position and did not look in the contractor's direction for the rest of the shift, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. That evening, Okafor found Bryce at the end of the tool rack before the shift released. She said, "The contractor. This morning." She didn't have to do that. Bryce looked at her for a moment, then back at the rack. "No," he said. She didn't. He went to the contractor's workstation on the pretense of returning a calibration card, looked at the desk without touching anything, and went back to his space. Stallworth pulled the full maintenance duty roster for the prior 30 days from the DCMA file share. Legitimate access. Properly documented. Printed it on the contractor office printer, and added it to the chain of custody binder. The binder was 4 inches thick now and growing. She closed the notebook. She looked up. Her expression had not changed. Comment Halyard below. If you think she should have walked. Keep watching, because what Halloran does next isn't cruelty anymore. It's federal. Halloran wasn't on the floor at all on day 12. He didn't need to be. A safety incident report arrived on DCMA Regional Coordinator Garrett's desk before 0800 hours, dated 5 days prior, time-stamped to a shift Stallworth was not assigned to, certified by signatures that would take forensic analysis to unravel. Coordinator Garrett was 50-something, overworked in the procedural way of civilian administrators who have spent 20 years trusting certified paperwork, and he suspended the badge without calling her first. The report was certified. His job was to act on certified reports. He was not malicious. He was a system, and someone with 9 years of institutional knowledge had learned how to run the system as precisely as he ran any other piece of equipment on his floor. The instrument was not a slap this time. The instrument was a form, with the right number in the right box, and a signature block completed in the right ink. By 0930, her badge was suspended. By 1000, she was in a contractor holding office on the other side of the station. A beige room, which is how these rooms are always finished, as though the specific shade communicates institutional neutrality. 2 chairs, a laminate table, A window overlooking the flight line where F-35Bs were doing touch and goes in the gray morning light, small and fast against the overcast. She sat down. She asked the administrator, once, for the citation number of the relevant DCMA safety protocol. DQR 1252-246, subparagraph 3. The administrator blinked twice and confirmed it. She nodded. That was the last thing she said for the next 9 hours. She had a government legal pad and 9 hours, and she used both. By hand, in engineering notation, the compressed, specific kind that doesn't require translation at a federal proceeding, that a prosecutor receives and reads once and does not need to rewrite. She built a chain of custody timeline covering every lot number she had tracked across 10 months of embed. Lot 8814 Delta and its certification path through 3 intermediary warehouses. Lot 7203 Foxtrot, which had entered MAGNUM HANGAR's supply chain in October 2025 under a Boeing acceptance number that did not correspond to any Boeing document in the federal database. Lot 99916 Bravo, 6 cartridges, installed on Iron Fist 4's sequencer assembly in November and pulled under her recommendation in December after she flagged the torque certification discrepancy, a pull that Halloran had signed off on without comment, which was itself an entry on the chain, because a man who believed the certifications were valid does not sign off on a pull without comment. Not a complaint, not a grievance, a document, the kind that enters evidence and stays there. The flight line view outside the window changed over the course of the 9 hours. By noon, the touch and goes had stopped. By early afternoon, a single T-6 trainer moved through stalls over the bay in long, quiet arcs. By 1600, the field was still. She sat in the same chair through all of it. The administrator knocked once at 1200 to ask if she needed anything. She said water. He brought it in a paper cup. She thanked him. 9 years of administering badge suspensions, and he later told the NCIS agent that he had never seen anyone sit in that room like they were somewhere else they had chosen to be. At 1500 hours, First Lieutenant Carl Vesper appeared in the parking area outside the holding office window. 26 years old, supply officer, the one who had run the paperwork on 3 of the 7 lot transfers she had documented. The nervous energy on him was the specific kind that comes not from fear of being caught, but from having already understood for some time that the thing you did cannot be undone, and not having found a way to live with that knowledge quietly. He stood in the parking area for 40 seconds, checked his watch twice, looked once toward the holding office window, not quite directly at it, but close enough, and then walked away with the deliberate pace of a man trying to appear as though he has somewhere else to be. His name had not been spoken aloud on this floor yet. His face was simply on the wrong side of a window that was going to matter, and the 40 seconds of watching from the parking lot would go into the legal pad as its own entry. At 1830 hours, they returned her badge. She walked back across the station in the early evening light. In contractor lodging that night, she unfolded the legal pad under the desk lamp. 47 entries, each dated, each cross-referenced to a lot number or a signature block or an installation record. She added one more at the bottom of the chain, a number she had found today, buried in the internal formatting of the certifying block on the falsified incident report itself. The certifying official had used a procurement authorization sequence that appeared in 2 other entries on the pad. Beside the new number, in the margin, Vesper. Beneath that, underlined once, 8814 Delta. By day 19, Valdez had 4 separate anomalies in his logbook, and none of them resolved into any civilian contractor he had encountered in 32 years of service. Not the stillness on day 0, not the specification recall in the brief, not the 9-hour badge suspension absorbed without a formal grievance, not the way she moved through a room as though she had already measured it. 4 anomalies, and each one separately had an explanation, if you were willing to reach for one, and all four together did not. He had been in this institution long enough to know the difference between a person who had learned professional composure and a person who had been trained to a different standard entirely. He came to the torque wrench calibration session at 1500 hours and positioned himself at the far end of the calibration bench, where he could observe without appearing to be watching anything specific. Price was running the session, calibration of a CH-53K rotor head fitting. 3 junior Marines at the bench, Stallworth with a calibration card in both hands, the curved chrome surface of the fitting bright under the overhead lights. Price dropped a heavy tool casing behind her without warning. The crack of it on the deck, sharp and percussive, the kind of sound that bypasses conscious processing entirely, would have made most people spin or drop what they were holding or produce some involuntary sound. Stallworth's feet did not shift. Her hands, flat on the calibration card, stayed on the card. Her eyes moved, not toward the source of the sound, but to the polished surface of the rotor head fitting, the reflected image in the chrome where she could see the deck behind her without turning. She located the source in the reflection, confirmed it, settled back to the calibration card in approximately 1 second. Not a reaction controlled. A trained response running so cleanly that the suppression was invisible. Price picked up the casing and said nothing. For the rest of the session, he watched where her eyes went, how she used the reflective surface of the fitting without appearing to use it, how she positioned herself in relation to any polished object in her workspace. He was doing math. The math kept producing the same answer. 2 days before the calibration session, Price had found Valdez at the parts crib between callouts and said quietly, "She's not a contractor." He hadn't elaborated. Valdez looked at him for a moment, then at the floor, then said, "No, she's not." Neither said anything else. They went back to work. But Valdez had opened the second notebook that evening and written 2 more entries under halyard. The Iron Fist 2 calibration cards from the session were filed as normal. Everything about the afternoon was documentable as routine. That was the point. After the session, Stallworth photographed 2 specific pages of the Iron Fist 2 manifest with the camera in her badge lanyard and transmitted to her handler. Vesper confirmed. Becker arriving within 72 hours per intercept. Hold. She powered the phone off. 4 days. At 2000 hours, Valdez sat in his personal vehicle at the base perimeter, engine off, the flat dark of the Atlantic coast beyond the fence. This was the 3rd time in 19 days he had come here after the shift ended. The first time he had sat for 12 minutes and driven home without making a call. The second time he had started to dial and stopped. Tonight he dialed. Personal cell in hand, the number he hadn't called in nearly 2 years. Retired. A gunny he had served with at Lejeune before the gunny had gone over to the programs that didn't appear in unit rosters. Voice only, no pleasantries. He described 19 days of anomalies without naming the contractor. The stillness at the strike on day 0. The specification recall from memory in the brief on day 2. The 9-hour badge hold absorbed without a grievance. The acoustic test this afternoon. The eyes going to the chrome reflection instead of the dropped casing. He described the posture, the movement economy, the specific quality of the stillness in a crowd. He described what he knew and what he couldn't account for, and he was precise about which was which. The stillness, Valdez said, like 29 Palms, 3 years ago, joint exercise. Long pause on the line. "If she's who you think she is, Sergeant Major," the retired contact said, "walk away and clear your bay before she does." Valdez asked one follow-up question. The gunny didn't answer it. "Walk away." The call ended. He sat in the truck for 7 minutes. He counted them. Then he drove back to base and did not stop at the hangar. At his desk, he opened his logbook to the entry from day 0 and read what he had written there. Then he took the second notebook, plain green cover, nothing on the spine, nothing official, and opened it to the first page and wrote across the top in block letters. Halyard. Who made that call, and what does Valdez know that 40 Marines on that floor don't? Drop Halyard in the comments and keep watching. The answer changes everything. Day 24 was quiet on the floor. Halloran was at an off-station coordination meeting, the kind where he was someone else's institutional authority, sitting at a table where no one would call a lot number from memory and interrupt him. The junior Marines ran their calibrations and signed their cards and went home at 1700 hours. The only lit window in the contractor lodging block at 2130 hours was room 114. No personal items on the desk, watch off, face down in the corner of the table. 3 hairpins in a small ceramic dish, not 2, 3, which is regulation and is also one more than most women bother with on a day off the floor. Contractor lanyard coiled beneath the vest on the door hook, where it had hung every night for 10 months without variation. Her hands were around a mug that had gone cold more than an hour earlier. She hadn't moved to heat it. She opened the go bag on the floor beside the desk. Encrypted phone, powered off. Laminated lot number sheet, edges worn from 10 months of handling. A folded photograph in the inner pocket behind the laminated sheet, face down, the creases softened with use. She removed the lot number sheet and held it under the desk lamp. The last entry, in her own hand. Lot, T81R4 Delta. Magnum Hangar. She had identified the source lot in 2024. She had been embedded at this station since July 2025. She was 30 years old, and she had been at this for longer than most people who had not done this kind of work would believe a person could sustain it. Her call sign was Halyard 1. She had been a commissioned Marine officer since she was 22, infantry qualified before she was 23, rifle platoon commander, company commander at 25. A Marine raider since 26, among the youngest element leaders in MARSOC history at the time she was assigned. In November of 2022, she led a 4-person element southwest of Tal Tamr in northern Syria into a wadi after dark to recover a downed F-35B pilot. Major Owen Marchetti, his ejection seat sequencer, had fired 10,000 feet late because the nitrogen cartridges in the assembly had been substituted at depot level with parts certified to a lower tolerance standard. Parts that looked right, were packaged right, were certified right, and were not right. She walked Marchetti out alive. She carried Gunnery Sergeant Eli Tovar and Sergeant Rafael Cordero out herself, through the exfil, both of them, in the dark. The lot that killed them traced across 2 years and 3 air stations and a chain of falsified safety of flight acceptance forms to a maintenance bay on the Atlantic coast. This maintenance bay, she thought, they died because someone in this building signed a lot acceptance form they never verified. Tovar knew what counterfeit looked like. He'd flagged bad parts 3 times on prior deployments. He just didn't know it would be the sequencer. Tovar had been in the Marine Corps for 16 years when she first met him. He called his mother every Sunday at 1300 hours, wherever in the world he happened to be. And he was the kind of NCO who remembered the names of his raiders' siblings, not just their raiders. She had carried him 3,000 meters through a Syrian wadi in the dark, and she would not write that in the logbook or say it in the testimony, and she would not think about it here in this room, because thinking about it here served nothing. And she was not done yet. 4 days. She removed the photograph from the inner pocket of the go bag. She did not unfold it. She placed it face down on the desk beside the lot number sheet and looked at the back of it for a long time, long enough that the fluorescent tube overhead cycled through one full flicker and steadied again. Then she powered on the encrypted phone and typed 3 words. On schedule. Continue. She powered it off. The difficulty in long embed work was never the duration. It was the maintenance of a performance that had to be simultaneously perfect enough to hold and imperfect enough to be believed, and doing that while also running an actual investigation, and doing both of those things while carrying what she was carrying. The mug on the desk, the photograph face down, the lot number on the laminated sheet in her own handwriting. 4 days, and the weight did not get lighter. You simply got better at distributing it. She reached into the go bag one final time and removed a small evidence envelope, sealed with red tape, her own handwriting across the exterior. LT. Carl Vesper, procurement signature. Lot, 8814 Delta, day +12. She set it on top of the lot number sheet. Tomorrow was day 25. She had 4 days. Halloran had run out of institutional options somewhere in the week preceding day 29, and at 21:45 hours, he made the move that could not be walked back. He came into the contractor lockup with 2 people. The lockup was a chain-link storage bay inside the hangar, numbered tool cabinets along 2 walls, pegboard for the smaller calibration equipment, the low amber light of the after-hours system, the hangar outside gone dark and still except for the perimeter, lighting bleeding through the high windows. Not a place anyone would look for on a normal night. First Lieutenant Carl Vesper was there. He had a folder of predated discrepancy forms under one arm, and the expression of a man who has fully understood what he's done, and has spent 3 weeks trying to locate a way backward, and confirmed there isn't one. His eyes moved to the lockup entrance every 30 seconds, with the regularity of a man waiting to be caught. Pim Becker was there, late 40s, Dutch accented, canvas duffel on his shoulder, no uniform, no installation identification, no reason at all to be on a Marine Corps air station at 2200 hours. Becker had sourced counterfeit ejection seat components into military supply chains for 4 years across 3 air stations, and he carried himself with the calm of a man for whom wrong decisions had long since become simply the environment. He set the duffel beside Cabinet 7 and unzipped it without being asked. Halloran opened Cabinet 7 with a duplicate key, a copy of a key that should not have had a copy. Vesper placed the predated discrepancy forms against the lower shelf, signatures approximated to Stallworth's handwriting in the particular way that passes a rapid review but does not survive forensic examination. Becker removed 3 untagged sequencer cartridges from the duffel and set them in the lower drawer with the practiced placement of someone who has done this before at other stations. The drawer closed. The cabinet locked. Halloran looked up at the ventilation louver above cabinet row 7. He looked at it for 4 full seconds. Not a conscious security check, but the specific low-grade paranoia of 4 years of accumulating wrong decisions. A sensitivity to the environment that functioned like instinct but wasn't. He stared at the louver. He stood there and stared at it. Then he waved it off and turned away. The hairpin camera in the ventilation louver had been streaming since 21:45 hours. Installed on day 3. Fed through an encrypted relay to the ruggedized laptop in room 114 and simultaneously to her MARSOC handler. It captured Halloran's face completely as he turned from the louver. The 4-second look, the wave, the half-second of doubt. His face in full resolution walking away from the thing he should have examined. In room 114, she stood at the desk with her arms crossed and her feet flat and shoulder width on the linoleum floor, the laptop open on the desk in front of her. She worked through the image, Halloran's hands on the cabinet key, Vesper's folder against the shelf, Becker's duffel, the drawer closing on 3 untagged cartridges, the access log timestamp on the side monitor, the cabinet number legible, the faces all confirmed. She logged each element in sequence. She had waited 29 days for him to cross a line he couldn't uncross. He crossed it at 2200 hours on day 29, in front of a camera, with his name in the access log and his fingerprints on a cabinet that didn't belong to him, and 3 cartridges in a drawer that would match the lot numbers in her chain of custody binder 14 ways. Watching him wave off the ventilation louver and walk away from what he should have examined, self-satisfied, already riding the confidence of a man who believes he has just decisively won, she produced a small smile. Private, almost amused. Not satisfaction, which is what lesser victories feel like. Something sharper and quieter, the particular quality of having waited long enough for a thing to become permanent. It lasted 3 seconds. Then it was gone, and she was composing the transmission to her handler. At 23:10 hours, Halloran crossed the apron with the stride of a man who has just settled something decisively. Stallworth came around the building corner on her standard perimeter walk, the cover she used for the nights she couldn't sleep, which were most of them now, 4 days from the end. They passed within 10 feet of each other in the dark. She looked up from her path. She met his eyes. She gave him the small smile, once, 1 second, the same one, private and sharp, and then walked on into the dark. He stopped. He stood on the apron and watched her go. The smile didn't fit any category he had for contractors, or for women, or for anyone who should have been on the losing end of what had just happened in that lockup. He stood there for a moment longer than he understood, and then he went inside. Tomorrow was day 30. The day 30. Morning brief began at 0700 hours, the same time it had begun for 9 years, the same geometry of bodies, in the same positions on the floor. Halloran at the front with his callouts. 36 Marines and 4 NCOs arranged in the familiar pattern. Guy Sergeant Bryce at the tool rack. Lieutenant Vesper at the edge of the group, not quite looking at anything. The specific not looking of a man who hasn't slept and doesn't know what his face is doing without active supervision. Stallworth at her folding table in the corner, pen in hand, clipboard flat. Everything the same. Sergeant Major Cyrus Valdez was near Center Bay. He had been there since 0645, 15 minutes before the brief, standing on the deck with his logbook closed in both hands, positioned where he could see the full floor and every person on it. He looked at Stallworth twice before the brief began, the second time for longer than the first, and with a different quality of attention. At 0718 he spoke, not to Halloran, not to the room, directly to the contractor at the folding table, in a voice calibrated to carry to the overhead cranes, to the far wall, to the open bay doors and the apron beyond. Halyard 1. Just the call sign. Nothing before it, nothing after it. The brief went silent in the specific way of a room whose gravity has just changed. Halloran's head came up from his call-out sheet. Every Marine on the floor turned. Stallworth set her pen on the clipboard. She rose from the folding chair with the unhurried economy of someone who had risen from many briefings in many rooms, feet coming to shoulder width, hips squaring, hands settling flat at her thighs for exactly 1 beat. Then she was simply standing at attention on the bay deck, in a high-visibility safety vest, in steel-toed boots, on the floor of MAGNUM HANGAR. Every Marine who had spent 30 days watching a civilian contractor go about her clipboard work now saw what had been there since day 0, visible in every posture and every movement and every moment of stillness they had attributed to some contractor habit or personal quirk. She had never in her life stood any other way. The contractor posture and the military posture were the same posture. They had always been the same posture. There was no version of her that stood differently. 23 minutes passed. The floor held. Gisk Price at the tool rack had not moved since Valdez spoke the call sign. He was watching the folding table, watching the woman who had been standing at that table for 30 days in a contractor vest and steel-toed boots, and he was confirming what he had been doing math on since day 5. Every anomaly he had filed quietly in his own running count was resolving now into a single coherent answer that he should not have been surprised by and was surprised by anyway. Because even when you're watching for something, there's a quality of difference between suspecting it and seeing it confirmed in the full geometry of a room that has just changed. He had 4 pages of notes in his own pocket about this contractor. He had given none of them to anyone. They would be in the NCIS supervisory agent's hands before the end of the day. The rotors were audible before the aircraft was visible, vibration through the deck plates, through the soles of 36 pairs of boots, through the structural members of the bay doors. The V-22 Osprey settled on the apron, and Brigadier General Margaret Ostland, Commander Marine Forces Special Operations Command, walked the full length of Magnum Hangar without pausing. Provost Marshal Marines to her left, in pairs. An NCIS supervisory agent to her right. The overhead fluorescents hummed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 40 people in a very large room, and the only sounds were footsteps on painted concrete. Ostland stopped 4 feet from Stallworth and rendered a full formal salute. Every Marine on the floor, all 36, dropped their tools and came to the position of attention. At the parts crib, Halloran's face moved through its sequence in approximately 4 seconds. Confusion first. A MARSOC call sign spoken aloud on this floor, today. Then disbelief. A brigadier general rendering full military honors to a woman in a contractor vest. Then recognition arriving in stages, the math resolving that should have resolved 10 months earlier. She is not looking at the general the way a civilian looks at a general. She returned the salute. She knew exactly how to return a salute. She had always known. Then the specific, vertiginous horror of a man who has just understood how long the camera in the louver above Cabinet 7 had been running and what it had captured the previous night. The Provost Marshal team moved toward him. He didn't run. He looked at Stallworth once, across the full width of the hangar, the last time he would see her outside a federal proceeding. She had already returned the general's salute and was walking toward the NCIS supervisory agent with the ruggedized laptop under her arm. The team walked Halloran toward the open bay doors. He passed the CH-53K King Stallion he had maintained for 9 years, close enough to touch the gray fuselage, close enough to lay a hand on the landing gear fairing he had signed off more times than he could count, and he did not look at it. He looked at the floor. He looked at the doors. 40 Marines remained at the position of attention until he was through the doors and out of the bay, and gone. What happened in the 72 hours after day 30 did not happen slowly. It happened the way structural failures happen, not gradually, not with warning, but 1 fracture, and then 9, and then the whole thing coming apart faster than anyone who built it had imagined possible. NCIS forensic teams sealed Magnum Hangar before 0900 hours on day 31. 9 NCOs across 3 Marine Corps air stations were in Provost Marshal custody before noon. 2 civilian Department of Defense contracting officials appeared in shackles at a federal district court initial hearing before the business day ended. Total counterfeit ejection seat components recovered across 3 sites and 4 intermediary warehouses. $41 million. The number was in the federal complaint. It looked different printed out than it sounded spoken aloud. At 1600 hours, the wing's senior maintenance officer was arrested in a hotel corridor in Norfolk by federal agents while attempting to board a connecting flight to Frankfurt. One-way ticket, purchased 6 hours after Halloran's arrest. His luggage contained 2 laptops and a thumb drive. He offered no explanation for any of it, which was, in some ways, the most efficient decision he'd made in 4 years. At 1743 hours, a federal warrant team arrived at Slip 44 in the Annapolis Marina. Merrick Hollick, the network's civilian wholesale broker, the upstream supplier whose name appeared in Stallworth's chain of custody binder 14 times under 7 different company registrations, was gone. The mooring line was still wet. The slip had been vacated 17 minutes before the team arrived. The agent on scene photographed the wet line and filed the photograph and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say about a wet mooring line without a boat attached to it. A warrant for Hollisch's arrest was issued the same day. An international coordination request went to Europol within 48 hours. The file on Marek Hollisch remained open. It was the only file from the MAGNUM HANGAR network that remained open. Lance Corporal Demi Okafor was called to an NCIS interview room on day 31. She sat straight in the chair and gave a clear, uncoached, completely linear account of day 5. The rag, the workstation, the cluster of NCOs at the parts crib, the moment the contractor took 2 steps left and changed what the room was looking at. The agent listened without interrupting. Then she asked, "Did the contractor say anything to you during that incident?" Okafor thought for a moment. She said, "Leave the rag. I'll wipe it myself." That was all. The agent wrote it down exactly as Okafor said it. She would cite that testimony at the federal sentencing hearing 4 months later, in a passage noting that the undercover investigator had, on day 5 of a 30-day operation, shielded a junior Marine from institutional humiliation, and that the junior Marine had remembered it clearly. Geisig Price walked into the NCIS supervisory agent's temporary office on the afternoon of day 31 and set a plain green notebook on the desk without being asked and without a great deal of explanation. 11 pages of entries in block letters, every anomaly Valdez had logged since day 0, dated and described in the kind of detail that is only possible when someone has been watching carefully and writing carefully and knows precisely the difference between what they observed and what they concluded. The first page said, "Halyard" across the top. It entered evidence as Exhibit 47. If you stayed this far, you already know what she was carrying. Leave a halyard in the comments for Tovar and Cordero. We'll keep going. 3 weeks later, there was a marine cemetery on the Atlantic coast. A quiet Tuesday. Low gray cloud and wind through the grass between the headstones, the kind of morning that is neither warm nor cold, but simply present. Stallworth walked a gravel path in civilian clothes, dark trousers, a plain jacket, no vest, no lanyard, no clipboard, no function. Just a person walking a gravel path between stones. She stopped at 2 headstones placed side by side. She stood there without moving for a moment. Then she crouched and set a single brass challenge coin in the grass between them, not on top of either stone, not centered on a name, in the space between them, in the few inches of grass where the 2 stones were close enough to share it. She stood. She did not speak. The encrypted phone in her jacket pocket vibrated once. She looked at the screen. Halyard is still standing. Hollisch is in Constanza. She read it once. She put the phone in her pocket. She looked at the space between 2 names cut into stone, and then she turned and walked back up the gravel path alone. Every soldier carries a story that few ever hear. Listen with your heart. Thank you for staying and watching. Subscribe to Honor Tales for more.